Hey everyone, now that we've learned a little about dark romanticism, we're going to check out two very short stories called The Oval Portrait and The Birthmark. So, we're going to go ahead and start with The Oval Portrait. And what we'll do is we'll read together and then we'll stop every now and then to make sure we understand what's going on in the story. So, The Oval Portrait, Edgar Allan Poe, 1850. The chateau into which my valet had ventured to make forcible entrance, rather than permit me in my desperately wounded condition to pass a night in the open air, was one of those piles of commingled gloom and grandeur which have so long frowned among the Apennines, not less, in fact, than in the fancy of Mrs. Radcliffe. To all appearance, it had been temporarily and very lately abandoned. We established ourselves in one of the smallest and least sumptuously furnished apartments. It lay in a remote turret of the building. Its decorations were rich, yet tattered and antique. Its walls were hung with tapestry and bedecked with manifold and multiform armorial trophies, together with an unusually great number of very spirited modern paintings in frames of rich golden arabesque. In these paintings, which depended from the walls not only in their main surfaces, but in very many nooks which the bizarre architecture of the chateau rendered necessary. In these paintings, my incipient delirium perhaps had caused me to take a deep interest, so that I bade Pedro to close the heavy shutters of the room, since it was already night, to light the tongues of a tall candelabrum which stood by the head of my bed, and to throw open far and wide the fringed curtains of black velvet which enveloped the bed itself. I wished all this done that I might resign myself, if not to sleep, at least alternately, to the contemplation of these pictures and the perusal of a small volume which had been found upon the pillow, and which purported to criticize and describe them. So let's pause for a moment. This paragraph tells us about the setting of the story. So we have two men, one called Pedro, who is the valet, or basically butler, of the other man who is narrating the story. So it tells us that the valet broke into this decrepit little chateau, which is really like a small castle, because his master was wounded. So the narrator of the story is wounded and feeling a little delirious, which he says later in around line 13. So they've broken into this place, which is gloomy and yet glorious, right? Because it's a castle. It has all these paintings everywhere. It talks about rich decorations, and yet they're tattered and antique, right? There's tapestries hung all over the wall, rich golden picture frames, and they hang from all the surfaces. But the architecture of the chateau is so strange that they have pictures hiding in little nooks and crannies and corners. And these paintings are kind of fascinating him right now. And he does admit that probably it's because he's kind of feeling a little off and delirious. So when you're wounded and not feeling well or sick, you sometimes kind of imagine things, right? So he's setting us up to understand that he's not a super reliable narrator. But they've found a little corner of the castle where they're all going to hang out. Both of them are going to sleep for the night. And he's in this big antique bed that has black curtains hanging around it. So they close them so the light doesn't come in. Well, he says that he found a book on the pillow, which is supposed to critique all of these portraits. So let's continue. Long, long I read, and devoutly, devoutly I gazed. Rapidly and gloriously the hours flew by, and the deep midnight came. The position of the candelabrum displeased me, and outreaching my hand with difficulty, rather than disturb my slumbering valet, I placed it so as to throw its rays more fully upon the book. So the night is passing, and he gets into a position where he needs to move the candle so that he can read better. But the action produced an effect altogether unanticipated. The rays of the numerous candles, for there were many, now fell within a niche of the room which had hitherto been thrown into deep shade by one of the bedposts. I thus saw in vivid light a picture all unnoticed before. It was the portrait of a young girl just ripening into womanhood. I glanced at the painting hurriedly and then closed my eyes. Why I did this was not at first apparent, even to my own perception. But while my lids remained thus shut, I ran over in my mind my reason for so shutting them. It was an impulsive moment to gain time for thought, to make sure that my vision had not deceived me, to calm and subdue my fancy for a more sober and more certain gaze. In a few moments, I looked again fixedly at the painting. that I now saw aright I could not and would not doubt. For the first flashing of the candles upon the canvas had seemed to dissipate the dreamy stupor which was stealing over my senses, and to startle me at once into waking life. So now that he's moved this candelabrum, all of a sudden a picture becomes visible that he had not been able to see before, right? And his immediate reaction to it is to shut his eyes and look away. And what's in this portrait? He says it's the portrait of a young girl just ripening into womanhood. So probably 17, 18, 19, 20, somewhere in there. He says he first glanced really quickly at it, but then closes his eyes and tries to, whoa, what's going on? And then he's trying to figure out, why did he have that reaction? Why did he want to look away immediately? So a moment later, he looks back at the painting to see if he can figure it out, right? And he says that it startled him kind of out of his dreamy stupor. Let's find out why. The portrait, as I have already said, was that of a young girl. It was a mere head and shoulders, done in what is technically termed a vignette manner, much in the style of the favored heads of Sully. The arms, the bosom, and even the ends of the radiant hair melted imperceptibly into the vague yet deep shadow which formed the background of the whole. The frame was oval, richly gilded and filigreed in Moresque. As a thing of art, nothing could be more admirable than the painting itself. But it could have been neither the execution of the work nor the immortal beauty of the countenance which had so suddenly and so vehemently moved me. Least of all, could it have been that my fancy, shaken from its half slumber, had mistaken the head for that of a living person? I saw at once that the peculiarities of the design, of the vignetting, and of the frame must have instantly dispelled such an idea, must have prevented even its momentary entertainment. Thinking earnestly upon these points, I remained for an hour perhaps, half sitting, half reclining, with my vision riveted upon the portrait. At length, satisfied with the true secret of its effect, I fell back within the bed. I had found the spell of the picture in an absolute likeliness of expression, which at first startling, finally confounded, subdued, and appalled me. With deep and reverent awe, I replaced the candelabrum in its former position. The cause of my deep agitation thus being shut from view, I sought eagerly the volume which discussed the paintings and their histories. Turning to the number which designated the oval portrait, I there read the vague and quaint words that follow. So why did it bother him so much? Because for a moment he thought it was a person, right? And he says, well, that's silly. There's a frame around the portrait. I should know that that's not a person, right? But it's so lifelike in its countenance when he looks at it that he thinks for a moment that the woman is actually in the room, right? So he talks about how even it was done in a vignette style. So a portrait that is the face, and then the background is darkly colored to bring out the face. And he says that nothing could be more admirable. It was a beautiful piece of artwork. The woman beautiful herself. And then he suddenly thinks, why is it that I thought that this was a real person? And he's probably a little freaked out because remember, he's injured. So he's a little delirious. And he says that it kind of woke him and moved him because, whoa, who's in the room with me all of a sudden, right? So finally, he's just like, I can't even look at this anymore. He moves the candle because it's so disruptive to him. It's so bothersome. It's so freaky to him to see what looks like a real person in the room that he has to move the light away so he can't see it anymore. Then he determines, I'm going to look at this book and find the description of this painting. So let's learn about the story of this painting. She was a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee. And evil was the hour when she saw and loved and wedded the painter. He, passionate, studious, austere, and having already a bride in his art. She, a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee, all light and smiles, and frolicsome as the young fawn, loving and cherishing of all things, hating only the art which was her rival, dreading only the palette and brushes and other torrid instruments which deprived her of the countenance of her lover. Let's pause for just a second there. So what have we learned? We have a young woman who's just married an artist, and the only thing that rivals his love for the woman is his love for art. And the only thing that the woman dislikes about her marriage is the art that she has to split her husband's love with, right? It was thus a terrible thing for the lady to hear the painter speak of his desire to portray even his young bride. But she was humble and obedient and sat meekly for many weeks in the dark, high turreted chamber where the light dripped upon the pale canvas only from overhead. But he, the painter, took glory in his work, which went on from hour to hour and from day to day. And he was passionate and wild and moody man, and who became lost in his reveries, so that he would not see the light which fell so ghastly in that lone turret, withered the health and spirits of his bride, who pined visibly to all but him. So the artist becomes so obsessed with painting this portrait of his wife that he almost can't even see that she's suffering, right? So it says the light is falling ghastly onto her, she is pining visibly to everybody but him. Everyone but him can see that she's suffering. Yet she smiled on and still on, uncomplainingly, because she saw that the painter, who had high renown, took a fervid and burning pleasure in his task, and wrought day and night to depict her who so loved him, and yet who grew daily more dispirited and weak. So even though she's growing weak and she's pining, she's withering away, even though this is happening, she sits on and doesn't complain because she sees that it's making her husband happy to complete this task, right? So even though she's growing dispirited and weak, she sits there for him. And in sooth, some who beheld the portrait spoke of its resemblance in low words, as of a mighty marvel, and a proof not less of the power of the painter than of his deep love for her whom he depicted so surpassingly well. So the people who come to admire his work are just completely shocked at how well he's depicting her beauty, that the painting itself is so beautiful. But at length, as the labor drew nearer to its conclusion, there were admitted none in the turret, for the painter had grown wild with the ardor of his work, and he turned his eyes from the canvas merely even to regard the countenance of his wife. And he would not see that the tints which he spread upon the canvas were drawn from the cheeks of her who sat beside him. So after a while, they don't admit anybody, and he hardly even looks away from his painting to check to make sure that he's matching the countenance or face of his wife. And when many weeks had passed, but little remained to do, save one brush upon the mouth and one tint upon the eye, the spirit of the lady again flickered up as the flame within the socket of the lamp. And when the brush was given and when the tint was placed, and for one moment, the painter stood entranced before the work which he had wrought. But in the next, while he yet gazed, he grew tremulous and very pallid and aghast, and crying with a loud voice, "This is indeed life itself!" turned suddenly to regard his beloved. She was dead. So towards the end of this project, he's so obsessed and so filled with fervor that he's barely even looking at his wife anymore. And he gets to the point where it's almost finished. And suddenly his wife is enlivened with spirit, right? She comes alive again with spirit and is excited that it's about to be finished. But just as he puts that last bit of paint on and looks at it and admires it and says, "Oh my gosh, it is the living woman right here in this painting," he looks over to his wife and she has died.